Thank you, Kim, and FutureCon events. I'm very excited to be here with each of you today and to be among local colleagues and friends. I'm sure some of us have crossed paths before. And so as Kim mentioned, I'm here to talk about transforming information security, really to look ahead, right? So we're here at FutureCon and what's coming down the road. We heard a lot today about where we're at now, what we need to do, and it's quite the burden, right? So how can this possibly change? I'm going to start with the current threat landscape, which anyone in the security profession understands that you have quite the burden on your hands. Our threat actors, I have on the slide, it says increasingly sophisticated. Not necessarily. I mean, if you think back to 25 or more years ago when I started, yes, absolutely, because then they were script kiddies, they were people just testing things out, it wasn't malicious, we weren't so concerned about attacks at that time, right? They didn't have the impact that they have today. And it gradually changed. And threat actors became more focused, and we started to see specific trends from different threat actors. Now I'll dive into that a little bit, and one of the courses I teach at Georgetown is on cyber threat intelligence. So we dive into cultural norms and identity, and it has a real impact in terms of the longer term risk of attacks. So we transitioned from those script kiddie attacks to advanced persistent threats or that's what we dubbed it at the time, right? A decade ago. Probably more. I guess it's more like 15 years. Time flies when you're having fun, right? So those attacks, we saw them largely from China, and they were after intellectual property theft. They were combining particular malware pieces and enabling an attack to happen in sequence. And the main goal was economic gain, right? Or technology gains to help the nation. And that fits into the cultural norms and also the time of the attacks. One of the pieces that comes forward from one of the resources that we use in the course is that China will attack if they know they will be successful. Think back to 15 years ago. They were pretty successful, weren't they? So it really fit the pattern from post-Cold War kinetic mapping into cyber. Now, for other recent attacks, I'll talk a little bit about Russian threat actors. SolarWinds is a great example. SolarWinds was well thought out, right? There was a package that everybody accepted because it was signed into your environment, and it had really broad base. Right. And so that was one of the themes we're still seeing, and we see, we saw with Kaseya and other attacks. The threat actors, although they hit this broad base, it successfully got them into their intended targets is likely the case, because once they were in, they didn't expand those attacks for everybody. Right. There was a small number of organizations that were attacked a bit more deeply. And then there was an even smaller set where data was exfiltrated. Now, as incident responders and CISOs and other roles in the industry, if you were affected by that attack, your response was to clean up your systems. You were told the only way to eradicate this is to rebuild your systems from scratch. And so if you had the resources to do that, which is really quite cumbersome, that's what you did. If we think about Russian threat actors, does anyone want to say what they're typically after? I think it's pretty well known. So, data, but why? No. Yes, to sow discord, right? So their end game is to use that data to figure out what are hot button issues? How can they pit people against each other? DHS has a great little flyer on pineapple pizza. So if you search pineapple pizza in DHS, you'll find this great flyer that shows how people get pitted against each other with really minuscule issues. So back to SolarWinds. We know data was taken from CISA, and we know that it was taken from Department of Justice. But if we think about things like MITRE ATT&CK framework or the Lockheed Martin kill chain, we end with action on objectives. Okay, data was exfiltrated. That really is terrible. Let's recover, right? Let's rebuild our systems, get back online, and accept the loss. But if you think about the risk is still there. And in my mind, SolarWinds hasn't come to fruition yet because we haven't seen what's going to happen with that data. So that goes in line with Russian threat actors and really thinking through what is the end game of this. And the collateral damage in that attack was extremely significant, right? It placed an undue burden on so many organizations. Additionally, there were other attacks at the same time that were quite similar. This hit development environments of many large organizations. And I know from two particular ones, it was quite a challenge for them to think about, how do I rebuild my systems? So this was from personal conversations. I won't name the large vendors, but it really got them thinking, wait, I have to touch each and every box in my data center to rebuild my development environment. That is too much of a burden. Looking forward, this helps because they realize they not only have to do this for their own environment, but they have to think forward to how can we not only automate, how can we manage at scale so that their environments are improved, but also yours. Right, so we're at a critical turning point, and there's a lot of other motivators. I'm going to try to walk through several of those motivators and then tie together what is a possible forward path if we all take positive steps towards that. Other threat actors, Iran is usually after revenge. And so in 2020, we saw Iranian threat actors use, in response to sanctions, they went after the financial industry in the United States. So they might not always go after the government. They might go after some other entity. And they used day one VPN exploits. Now, think about 2020. What were we all doing? We were just starting to work from home, and our infrastructures might not have been as agile. So we couldn't just patch our remote infrastructure because it was being used so heavily. And so you had to wait for downtime windows, which made those attacks a bit more successful. And that goes in line with some of their patterns dating back also to post-Cold War, right? Revenge and reuse. So the reuse piece is they used day one exploits. So published vulnerabilities that they were able to create exploits for. So these are some important patterns to think about when you do know the threat actor behind a particular attack, because you might have your end on objectives known, but what is the real risk, right? What might you still be facing? Are there ways to get out ahead of what you might be facing down the road? All right, so let's see. I think I hit most of this except for changes in the protocol stack. So as Kim mentioned in the introduction, I was a security area director in 2014 to 2018 in the IETF. In that role, you have the opportunity, I'll say, to review all the standards published, which is about 400 pages of reading every other week, right? So a significant amount of reading. What happened in 2013 was Snowden and very big changes in terms of how we saw additional threats. And there was an increased push for encryption on the wire, not just that, but strong encryption. So we have TLS 1.3 as a result of that big push. And we also have the ACME protocol, which automates, it's the automated certificate management environment. So this automates the encryption certificates for your TLS sessions, transport layer security. So, you know, when you connect to your website, that security. So we allowed that to go through, wherein before this time period, it was stopped because there's some vulnerabilities with that level of automation. And so the purists held back. But now the need to move to stronger encryption and it being more available was very clear to the community. And so that allowed a jump in encryption on the web to go from 30% to 80 or 90 where we are now. And the Acme protocol is largely behind that big jump. We got to 30% after Snowden, but then that next 60% was due to automation and automation at scale, right? So this is an important piece that we have to think about as we move forward, is that scale. We also have zero trust. Zero trust calls for pervasive encryption. It also helps to prevent lateral movement or to throw in more gates, right, as an attacker is moving about the network. So, and zero trust also includes verification. So you might be looking at the integrity of your systems, or at microservice level, the integrity, or your data, or some other aspect of your system. You're looking to make sure that your system is as expected. And then identity, of course, which I think most of us hear the most about in terms of zero trust. But those other gates matter because you can do that early detection. So we have these really important trends happening, which shift how we, or where we manage security, right? So it's shifting to the endpoint. That's where we have visibility if we embrace the trend of strong encryption end to end. Now, why is this important to think about? It's because that change is really pivotal, right? This is an inflection point in our industry that we can either take advantage of or we can let slide by. I think we should take advantage of it. And here's why. Okay, let's say this is a typical organization and each of these boxes represent something you had to purchase for your environment. It doesn't even cover the full set of tools that you need to secure your environment. And you hire maybe one or more full-time employees to manage each of those boxes. That has to be done for every organization, right? This is why we have our security professional deficit, because we have set up an undue burden on the end organizations to manage security. They buy one product that's not secure and need several other products to secure the first. It's an undue burden. And we can do better. We can do better at this transformative period. So how do we do better? Well, we have these important trends. Zero trust. If we think about zero trust in terms of that pattern I just showed, it's overwhelming. How can you possibly take on that type of management requirement to have integrity, authentication, authorization, and have those both be dynamic and pervasive encryption throughout your environment? How can you possibly take that on, right? And with the current resources you have? Well, it goes to the architectural patterns that we implement to deploy these technologies. So we really have to push back on vendors to not just design security into the initial products, but to also manage it at scale. And I'll get into more of what I mean by that and how we can achieve this, as well as some market research my team has done to show where we're at in this progression, because we are moving along these lines. So embracing these trends became really apparent in terms of how do we move forward. I also had conducted a survey in RFC 8404, probably the most controversial document I'd ever work on. And if you read it, you'll scratch your head and say, why would this even be controversial? So it is a survey of all different types of operators on what breaks when we have end-to-end encryption. And the reason is to understand, well, what breaks, not necessarily to fix it, but to understand the problem set, what our next steps are, so that we can be more thoughtful in how we move to this end-to-end encryption model. It's disruptive, right? Some products are going to go away. Some will result in mergers, right? Because some of the capabilities we have today that are add-on products are still needed. Those functions and features are needed, but can they be more integrated into the product that you're buying and also managed at scale so that you don't have to hire a person to do it. And yes, I think that's part of the answer is we'll have some more consolidation in the market to achieve built-in security, but let's also push for having it managed at scale. So this built-in or intrinsic security, I'm sure you're hearing this, right? The Executive Order 14028 lays this out pretty simply that we need to move towards built-in security and we need to move to allow list approaches. What does that mean? Our systems, our data, our people, our behaviors are as expected, because the as expected list is much smaller to maintain than the exception list. And we in security have a habit of starting out with the list of all the bad things, and then we switch to the list of, okay, what do I know and expect? But we really have to make a hard line on this and use validated and trusted assurance with architectural patterns that scale. So what do I mean by that? I'm going to give a few examples, and I'm happy to answer more questions later or have discussions and follow up afterwards as well. I'll give a great example is the manufacturer usage description, or MUD. How many people are familiar with MUD? No one. Okay. MUD is a really interesting protocol. It is initially intended for IoT devices, so your Internet of Things, right? And if you think about managing Internet of Things devices, the scale is just so enormous, we have to do better. And so engineers, I think it started at Cisco, came up with some really great ideas in terms of how can we pursue this. And it sets up a really nice architectural pattern. So the vendor responsible for a particular IoT device can create essentially like a firewall file that could be universally deployed out to every one of those types of devices. And it can be updated. It includes not just your firewall filtering rules, but also behavioral based ones. And it does it in an object oriented way to allow for, this universal deployment. So you have a very small group of engineers who are able to come up with this universal file that can be updated in time as needed to set out the boundaries, right? So small group of experts, universal deployment, so that we're not each making the same changes. And it can be updated in time. So let's say a vulnerability comes out and they can put something in to block traffic with an IOC in it, an indicator of compromise. That can just get pushed out. So it's a pretty cool idea. And they position this for IoT because they're constrained. There's a limited number of features that an IoT device supports. And so it was easier to do that. But the engineers did intend for it to go bigger. How could it go bigger? Well, you might tackle this with a microservice or some small component where you can come up with the pattern that scales, or the filter set that works for that particular piece. So that's one example. Another great example is DevSecOps. So this is another real one where we're seeing lots of traction, and if you're using cloud-based services that are aligned to DevSecOps, you might be taking advantage of this right now with continuous delivery. So if you have some cloud-based services with continuous delivery models, the engineers are actively working on code on a daily basis, and their updates get checked in and get published out into the live environment. They can do things like move workloads so that you get an updated version right away. And so this happens for you as a customer as part of this DevSecOps. So with some of your video conferencing, I know there was a week where I had to do an update every single day, and it was a little annoying. However, that was saving our organization from potential exploits because they were rapidly patching, and there might have been a vulnerability included in that needed immediate updating, right? So this is an important trend that scales. We don't have to wait 2 weeks for update cycles or even years for every organization to catch up, like that VPN example. So continuous delivery is a great example where they can have an immediate impact. The patching burden is taken away from each individual organization, right? So you're freed up from that task. And that's a good thing. And because the updates are so small, the testing isn't as extensive as if you're doing a big bundle of patches. So it's a great idea in terms of moving us forward in this theme of architectural patterns that scale. Now, some other examples. I work for Center for Internet Security, and it's a nonprofit. So these are free guides. If you're not familiar with the benchmarks or controls, if you're using them for your own organization, you can download them for free and deploy them, use them within your own organization. So the benchmarks are established by a group of experts who work together to figure out how do you best secure an application or a server. And in many cases, this includes the vendor responsible for the product as well, so that we get an accurate picture of what should be included in that benchmark. This is an example where we have a small group of experts that has an immediate large impact because everybody else benefits from that work. And this was born out of the NSA hardening guides, if any of you are as old as me. So if you remember those from more than 20, 25 years ago. But that was the beginnings of the CIS benchmarks. And the CIS controls, they are a set of controls that are prioritized based on attacks. So we have 3 different implementation groups in the controls. They map into all of the major control frameworks. So if you're already using a control framework, fantastic. That's holistic. What this does, it could be a layer on top of it. So you could say, okay, to your board, the reason why I'd like to make these particular changes in our program this year is because the 5 biggest attacks are addressed with these changes. And how do we know that? The CIS control team took the controls and the safeguards under each control, mapped them carefully into the MITRE ATT&CK framework. Then from there, they mapped it into every major breach report, including our own data. We host the Multi-State Information Sharing and Analysis Center to map out what are the biggest threats to the environment today. And then was able to rank these so you know what to go after first to reduce your risk. Now, having said that, the people aspect of this, a small group applying out so you don't have to do that work, it gets better because vendors are starting to, or have for some time, depending on the vendor, use the benchmarks, and you can buy your products that already meet these benchmarks. So that's another example of an architectural pattern that scales. So those are, CIS hardened images. But what I'd like to push for, and what I am pushing for, is that it's not just secure by design, right? That we have all of the right switches on and secure by default, but that it's managed over time to scale. And I'll get into how that's possible with some other examples. And so maybe I'll stay on this slide to, so that I can try to explain some of these concepts. How many people are familiar with the trusted boot process on a laptop or a server? Okay, so a few. This is, I find this to be a topic that people need a little bit more explanation because it's not familiar. The components are newer or weren't used a few years ago, and now they are forming the basis of our security going forward. And they're going to enable some of the automation at scale in addition to the remediation that we're going to see in the next it's probably 2 to 5 years because it's already emerging. The TPM is the Trusted Platform Module. It costs about $1. It's on every board that you buy on a computer. And my team did some market research to basically demonstrate that. So we'll be releasing that sometime soon. But essentially, we have about 100% market coverage for a TPM being on every board, and it's TPM version 2.0. So TPM's been around for over 20 years, but didn't start working well until about 2016. The TEE is the Trusted Execution Environment. Everyone remember Spectre Meltdown? So that was a side channel attack against this ability to execute in isolation. And so the TEE is part of your CPU. So the CPU, you think about it in two parts. Your rich execution environment that's not protected. There's a lot of functions that don't have to have execution in isolation, and the trusted execution environment. Spectre Meltdown has been patched, chips have been reimagined and updated, and so we've progressed from that point. There's still attacks that occur unless it was fixed in hardware, which it wasn't. I can go deeper if anyone wants offline, but I'm going to try to stay high level. But this allows us to have computation in isolation, and it's really important because the combination of those two components help us with cryptographic functions and verification, as well as execution on anything that is sensitive in our systems. Now, that trusted boot process, how does this tie in? Well, let's say you have a laptop and the system's you're going to turn it on. The first thing, some of them do, I don't know if all of them do this particular piece yet, but the rest they do, is there is an attribute certificate that lists out all of the components that are expected to be on that board. If there is a component that is not expected, or if there's a component that's missing, the system boot will halt right there and right there, right? So you have your first allow list check. Next, it's going to go through the firmware boot process, and it's going to check for policies and measurements of any of the functions happening, and it aligns to the firmware resiliency guide from NIST 800-193. So very systematic, and all vendors use that 800-193 document. And in some cases, they go to one that's further instantiated in work by the Trusted Computing Group. And so they've really done a nice job to have this universal ability to securely boot your laptop. Now, all of those checks and balances occur as you boot the system. If something is not as expected, a process is reset. If that keeps happening, your system locks up and you don't have access to your system. If it all checks out and you're on a Windows system, you have access to your to then unlock BitLocker, right? So BitLocker relies on that checking out appropriately. Apple systems use a T2 chip, so it's the same type of functionality. If you're using the fingerprint reader, you're using that T2 chip, right? So we have these basic processes in place, and we're not all touching those. We're not programming individually what should that firmware look like. The vendor is doing it by a small group of experts, and they're using technology called attestation. So we can start to apply this up the stack to do better, and that's happening. So you can see this in a number of vendor products where they are beginning to use attestation, and it's in place so that you have remediation, you have these verification checks, and it's starting to become easier. That's only going to grow, and it takes a while, because if you think about it, if something doesn't match, you're bricking a system. So that's a pretty severe consequence. That's why this can't happen overnight. And so let's give it 2 to 5 years, but this is going to help with that, not just built in secure, but managed securely over time. And I guess one part I left out is that boot process, it also checks at runtime, right? So if something happens to your firmware or your BIOS at runtime, your system can be bricked and you'll be notified that it's not operating the way you want. So we have some real opportunities for change here. Now, some of the other problems that we're facing right now is every major control framework asks us to do things like inventory our assets, and that includes software, and then it asks us to ensure compliance. So I touched on the compliance piece. We will get there. That will be fully automated in time, and I just ask that you press your vendors for that type of capability, right? Or if you're at a vendor, I'd love to talk to you more about how can you move to this to support users and organizations who don't have the resources. And I'll hit on that in a minute as well. So we can go up the stack for benchmarks. And for software assurance, SBOM should help. However, it depends on how we implement it, right? And so we have to be really careful about how we implement the software bill of materials and how we use them to understand how we build allow lists. If you're a large bank and you have lots of resources, you might take that on yourselves, right? And that might be something your team is really ready to do. But if you're a small or medium-sized business, you're going to want that assessed for you, right? So kind of like you're using your phone and you download an app. There are processes that take place to give you a level of assurance on that app before it runs on your phone. Ideally, we'll get to that level with software and allow listing from the SBOM work. And I have some blogs on that topic, and I'm talking to lots of different vendors on it. Part of my motivation behind this, it's twofold. So Kim mentioned the book I wrote, but additionally, I joined Center for Internet Security 2 years ago as their Chief Technology Officer. Center for Internet Security serves the state, local, tribal, and territorial organizations. These are, at the state level, they have more resources, but the local, tribal, and territorial, they have very few resources. So there are many, many stories I could tell. One that I'll highlight is a conversation I had with a county level CISO. And she said to me on the phone, their local entities, so your town clerk in your office, your fire department, your police department, your K through 12 schools, your Department of Public Works, all of these organizations are lucky if they can hire a high school student to manage their security. And look at the burden that we put on them. We can't do that anymore, right? So even if you think about cloud systems, they're all individualized, and you have to have some level of skill on your team in order to move to some of these cloud systems and have them managed over time. So that's one piece that we're working closely with many of the vendors to see how can we do better, how can we move towards something that's more fully managed, right? And how can we do that at scale? Transition accelerators. Zero trust is a big one, but we have a choice. Will we use the patterns that we've been using for the last 30 years, or will we migrate to ones that scale? Well, I've already provided some evidence that we are migrating to patterns that scale, but we have to push for more of them, right? In our purchasing decisions, at CIS, we can help with this with the small and the SLTTs, the state, local, tribal, and territorial organizations, in terms of providing recommendations and working to get better pricing on ones that better meet their needs, right? So services that are more fully automated and require less of them. So that's one important piece. And that market is equivalent to the federal market. So if any of you are vendors, the dollar spend per year in aggregate for those 90,000 organizations is the same as the federal market. That should help with some motivation. But then each of you at different organizations, if you're also pushing for these patterns, that will help. I have the wrong number on the executive order. It should be 1428. That is a big motivator as well. Vendors are responding, right? So they have to build in zero trust. They have to build in allow lists. The piece I'm adding on is let's do it at scale for management over time. And that's essential. Otherwise, we will continue to have collateral damage on large scale attacks. We want to continue to increase the cost for attackers, right? To trends going back as far as we've been fighting attacks, increase the costs, and to focus the damage on those that are targeted instead of having these broad scale, because attackers will get in, they will find a way, even as we become more secure. And SolarWinds is a great example of that, right? So, you embed an engineer and there are different social engineering tactics that will probably always work, but we can make it much more difficult. We can try to eliminate those broad-based attacks. And we've come a long way. I'd like to step back to another example in terms of how far we have come in 25 years or more than that. So I remember about 15 years ago sitting in a room at RSA. I used to work for RSA, and around the table there's maybe 25 of us in the room. And it was such a great conversation that some of it sticks in my mind still today. And there was somebody presenting on dwell time of attackers. It at that time was 2 to 2.5 years, right? And so those are the APT attacks from China that were often, on the network for 2.5 years before they were discovered. Now, fast forward to zero trust and all of the gates we've put up with thinking about things like the MITRE attack framework and the Lockheed Martin kill chain. How can we prevent lateral movement and add in detection early? You have the Okta attack where a partner was targeted, right? They got into the partner, but once they got into Okta, I believe I read it was caught within 25 minutes because they had zero trust in place. So this works. We've come a really long way in terms of, how do we detect attacks early and eliminate them. And now they're requiring their partners to move to zero trust and helping with that, right? So there's lots of steps we can take, but we also have to make it easier to move to zero trust because the small businesses are part of our ecosystem and they're being left behind unless we do that. Now, there's been OMB memos that also help, and they get very specific, like use MFA types that can't be stolen, right? Your credentials can't be stolen. And so that's a really important step. Additionally, in the European Union, we have the NIS directive and the DORA, the Digital Operation Resiliency Act. Those are more geared towards the organization, but hopefully in time they will also start to put the burden on the vendor instead of on the customer. Right? If we expect more from our vendors, then we can increase where we're at for security. I already mentioned the development environments and SolarWinds-like attacks and our general shift left trend for industry. So this is a big push for shift left with those architectural patterns at scale. So if you're interested to learn more on other examples of architectural patterns at scale and looking at this by taking a step back more holistically at an entire security program and how we can achieve that. It's in Transforming Information Security. If you're a developer, designer, this might help you to think about additional architectural patterns and not to set. The intent isn't to set all of the architectural patterns at scale, but to get you to think differently. Right? How can we close this gap? How can we more meaningfully move forward? And from our research, so my team has been doing research to see where we're at on the journey towards built-in security. And it's probably going to be a few months before that gets released, but it's really promising, right? We have those core components being built into equipment and universally deployed. And so we're going to be able to make some really big headway in, I think, the next 2 to 5 years. And if you asked me a year ago and before this research, I was saying 5 to 10 years. But we don't need to be as cautious with that anymore because this is really gaining traction and speed. So with that, thank you. I'd love your questions and engagement and follow up. And so any questions? Yes. Wait for the mic, please. Thank you.
Can we trust the vendor community to come up with the standards that we're going to build this future on?
So that's a great question. And part of what I think about at CIS, because we build benchmarks, right? And we build them with a community of experts that include the vendor, but also include other experts. So we'd like that continued engagement. And, in time we'll figure out once security is fully built in, the value of having that stamp on there or some other similar stamp like a DISA-STIG, right? So some of those control options that we have today might go away as we're more built in. But I'm sure some will remain because there will still be some variance in deployments. So great question. And yes, having trusted controls from consensus-based experts, unless you have some other ideas, I think is the way forward for now, right? And things change. Good question. Any other questions? I hope I didn't put you to sleep with lunch. Oh, maybe a virtual one. Thank you. Yes, he's going to come to you.
How can we explicitly help you with, oh, sorry. How can we explicitly help you with the SLED outreach?
Sure. So if you are a vendor, I'm happy to chat with you in terms of, opportunities there, to meet the needs of our market. And then we have something called our cyber market where there's some opportunities. And then we do some offerings for state, local, tribal, and territorial. So the pieces that we do is, let's say one of those entities is breached. They call us, right? And our SOC team responds and helps them to recover. Additionally, we offer some services, like we partner with some large vendors, and we go through rigorous processes to determine, who those are at times when we're ready to take on another service. And that includes things like malicious domain name blocking and bigger services that we more directly offer. We're going to begin a pilot very soon on email screening. But what we're trying to do is improve this baseline of people who don't have much to something that's a lot better. Right, so it's not always going to be the best possible service, but it's going to be one that we can scale and can improve the baseline for as many organizations as possible. And then we have opportunities like Cyber Market where services can be posted that might be might be applicable to small medium businesses or SLTTs. So that might be one place. And if you're looking for architectural patterns at scale and how to improve, then I'd be happy to work with you, towards, some ideas there and brainstorming to make those improvements. Yes.
The problem with benchmarks often, specifically in soft areas like data privacy disclosures, is they often become self-fulfilling in a way. Specifically, that Emily Chang in Bloomberg Technology News basically said about disclosures that those are the only ones, when she was specifically talking about Google or Facebook, that those are the only ones we know about. So can we trust that the benchmarks that companies like Microsoft, Adobe, Symantec, some of the biggest technology vendors out there are actually reflective when there's such a disincentive to actually come clean when you have a data privacy breach?
So first, I think we need to hold them to it. So from recent conversations with several large providers, hyperscalers, the number of attacks that are due to misconfiguration is basically the highest. One told me it was 80%, right? And so that's when you leave that responsibility up to every single organization and they don't have the resources. Benchmarks, if they are instantiated at purchase and then managed over time to prevent things like configuration drift or mistakes, will help to close that 80% gap, right? So while it might not be perfect, that configuration drift is a really big problem today. In terms of understanding the configuration process, if you see CIS's name up there, we've gone through an accreditation process. If you see a disastig, you should look to see, was there an accreditation process behind what I'm purchasing so that you know you're getting it at that level. Now we have the problem of drift still. So if you don't have the staff to manage that push on these abilities to either, right now you can have it audited so that you can manually go in and change with a number of the services, so that you can identify that something has drifted and you can remediate manually. But I personally would like to see us get there where it's just done more automatically. And I think we're heading in that direction. So I think accreditation is the answer to your question, right? So that you have some assurance that they've met an agreed upon set of configuration benchmarks by a set of experts that include some people outside of the vendor and a range of experts through a consensus process. Good question. Thank you.
Hello. Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
So you mentioned the controls, and first of all, I wanted to know how you develop these controls. Like, do you use standards such as NIST and ISO, or do you consider the various compliance regimes? Like, how do you develop the set of controls? And my second question is, Cloud Security Alliance has cloud control matrix. That is also, I think, a set of controls, and they map with a variety of standards as well as compliance regimes. What is the difference?
Great question. How do we develop the controls was the first question. And so these began, I don't know, at least 20 years ago. And do you remember the top 20 controls from SANS? That's what this is, the evolution of that SANS top 20, and CIS took it over. So Alan Powler, he was part of bringing that to CIS for CIS to take on that work, and it grew over time from consensus experts. And so at the same time these foundational frameworks were being developed, the critical controls were being developed. Now, the difference, you can use the CIS controls on its own, but you can use it in combination with any framework that is actually a fuller set of controls, because the CIS critical controls doesn't cover a few areas that are covered by the other frameworks, some of the physical pieces. And it's meant to be a prioritized set of controls. And within each control area, there are safeguards, and that's what's ranked, right? So that you know what to go after first. These get reviewed, I think it's every 18 months or so, and a new version is published at that time, because you have to reassess. Attacks change and the threat landscape changes, and so the controls change. Now, a few years back, Tony Sager initiated an effort, and Valisha, I'm not going to be able to pronounce Valisha's last name, has taken on some really great work that she leads, but a lot of other people participate in, for the community defense model. And so what this is that process I talked about earlier, where the controls and the safeguards are meticulously mapped into the MITRE ATT&CK framework. So you know which particular safeguards address specific attacks in the framework. Then there's a mapping to all of the data breach reports. Initially, I think they used the Verizon data breach report, but now basically all of the major breach reports are used, and our MSI-SAC data is used to prioritize, which are seen most, which are the most damaging attacks, and so that these controls provide, what do you go after first? If you're going to go to your board and say, we need to do this control, it's low-hanging fruit, these are the top 5 attacks, we're going to get hit if we're not addressing that, even though you might be covering some more important or some that are in IG2 or IG3, but you might have this gap that creeped up, right? And so that's where the controls come into play. The Cloud Security Alliance, CCM, it's a great resource because it, as you said, it maps each control framework against each other so that you have a consolidated look at all of those control frameworks. Not only that, it maps in all of the regulatory requirements that you might have to think about. So this is a great tool for cloud providers and organizations. I remember doing that mapping myself years and years ago at RSA when I was doing some consulting work. And gosh, it's a lot of work. So to have that maintained by Cloud Security Alliance is really a wonderful tool, right? So it's an example where we're scaling people resources and able to leverage that, right? And that, again, is a community of experts that contribute to that work. So I think there's 2 such activities that do that type of mapping, which is good. It's good to have more than one, but it's an invaluable resource. So those are the differences. Did you have another question as part of it?
No, thanks. I think, Thanks for the clarification. I think I probably was mistaken in the comparison, you know, because I have not seen the CIS. I have seen CIS benchmark, but not the controls.
Okay. Yes. Yeah. And there's even a ransomware report that was put out by IST that uses the controls to rank what you need to do to protect against ransomware. So it's just to provide a prioritization. What should you go after first?
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you.
We still have a couple more minutes, okay.
Hi. Great presentation. So, being a center of excellence, CIS, are you seeing any trends? Well, I guess what trends are you seeing around user authentication or sort of passwordless authentication to lower the risks of, say, social engineering, something like a CyberArk for privileged users? Is there something that the industry is moving towards to for users to move away from like a login ID and password?
Yes. So let's see, the OMB memo I mentioned called specifically for credentials that can't be stolen, they can't be replayed online, and they name specifically two technologies. Now, this is for the federal government, public key infrastructure, and I mean, for any of us that have been around long enough, I know I've managed PKI. I've set it up from scratch. It's a lot of work. It's not for the faint of heart. But now we have something called, it started as FIDO, or actually U2, Universal Two-Factor from Google, and then it went into the FIDO Alliance, and then was codified in W3C as WebAuthn. So WebAuthn, I think, is the likely winner in the next few years, and it sets forth a really interesting model because it uses raw public-private key pairs. So I'm only talking technology, right? Any vendor can sell this to you. I'm not going to get into the vendors. I'm going to go into the nuts and bolts so that you can look for this from whoever your provider is or implement it yourself. So WebAuthn uses public-private key pairs between a server and a client. Every user to every server gets their own key pair. Now, let's see. So this is something I'm trying to think about, and I have to do some research on in the coming weeks because I'm going to be giving some MFA talks in the next few months to the Multi-State Information Sharing and Analysis Center and pulling in some expert speakers exactly on these topics. Some interesting use cases might be if you have a shared identity, between, several organizations, and for us it might be state and local, for instance, right, where you can have that shared identity but different key pairs for applications. And that's really interesting because it can't be replayed. And I think it's a little bit more flexible in terms of the management. Yes, you'll have more keys, but you won't know as a user because they're going to be stored on a little device that's external to your system, ideally. It doesn't have to be, but ideally it's external. So there are some aspects of that should scale better and prevent the credential theft. So I think that's the general direction, and some resources you can look at. The NSA has a great guide that evaluates all different multi-factor authentication solutions. This was put out probably 3 years ago now. I want to say 2, but it's probably 3 because time flies. And what they did was they evaluated each of the MFA technologies and then ranked them according to NIST, 863? I think 863, and the levels for authentication that are defined there. So you can go look there if you're trying to figure out, is this adequate for my needs? Should I look forward to something like WebAuthn? PKI is a good choice, but it's just the management might be burdensome for your needs. So those are some things to evaluate, but the public-private key pair seems to be what's I think will win out in the years to come, but it'll take a huge amount of time to transition. Another piece is, what is the support for that? Support is increasing. It's on every mobile device. So W3C went through a lot of effort to make sure that every mobile device and browser supported WebAuthn. So it's just the server piece that we're working towards now in systems and applications. So it's growing. Thank you.
I think we are actually at time.
All right. Well, thank you so much. I really enjoyed being here with each of you today and look forward to follow up.